Bismillah. Okay, welcome Abdassamad Clarke. Abdassamad is a scholar, author, and commentator from Ulster and was formerly educated at Edinburgh University in mathematics and physics, and he studied Arabic and tajwid in Cairo and other Islamic sciences. He accepted Islam at the hands of Shaykh Abdalqadir as-Sufi in 1973, and in the 80s he was secretary to the Imam of Dublin Mosque, Shaykh Yahya Muhammad al-Hussein. He has written numerous articles and short pieces and made a number of intelligent Facebook posts, which I used to read back in the day. One of the books which he wrote, or the seminars he gave, was called Usury, the Root Causes of Injustice of Our Time. And usury is one of the topics which people don't really talk about anymore. It's a cornerstone of our economic system. And perhaps one could argue the cause of the environmental crisis and many other crises too. And today's discussion is going to be about usury. And we're going to talk about how the environmental crisis is a consequence of our financial system and what alternatives there are and what Islam offers. So thank you, Abdassamad Clarke, for coming.
Pleasure.
To get started, right, you can just talk about how you got interested in finance and economics, having studied mathematics and physics, which is kind of similar field, but the domain's a bit different.
Could I just say one thing, because you mentioned the seminar on usury, the root cause of the injustice of our time. Actually, I can lay no claim to that. That was a seminar that the people of Norwich did at a point where I wasn't living there. I was living in Ireland. I did attend the seminar. It was, in particular, it was led by Hajj Abdul Halim Orr, rahimahullah, who passed away a couple of years ago. And but it involved Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley and Hajj Aisha Bewley and a number of other people. And my part in it is that I produced a second edition later, which was renamed Banking, the Root Cause of the Injustice of Our Time, and had a little bit of extra material. So to connect, although it sounds like there's a connection between my interest in usury and my education before I was a Muslim in mathematics and physics, it didn't actually lead in that way. It didn't lead in that way at all. And in a way, it is very much connected to my becoming a Muslim, because like many people, I was looking at our society and feeling that it was going in the wrong direction, and that, of course, contributed, was a great part of my becoming a Muslim. A kind of a facile and mistaken approach to that would have been to then say, to blame it, for example, on industry, the industrial culture, and therefore to become a Luddite and go back to nature person. And really, I personally and the people of Norwich owed it to Shaykh Abdalqadir as-Sufi, rahimahullah, who pointed out the fundamental importance of usurious economics through all the crises of the age. The destruction of the environment, and a great many other things. So that was how I came to that.
I see. And so you were interested in the topic of finance and usury before you became a Muslim, and having studied Arabic, you spent a lot of time with the scholars as well. What is usury and riba? Like, sometimes people say there's a difference between the two of those, like how riba is used in the Quran by God 1400 years ago and usury.
Yes. Well, we make a distinction between riba and interest because it's very simple. It's simple-minded to think that usury consists simply of charging interest on a loan, and or riba consists of charging interest on a loan. But when you begin to look into the classical sources on what riba is, and one of the most important of them is the Muwatta of Imam Malik, which shows how it was regarded in the first 3 generations of Islam in Medina itself. You get a sense of what riba is, and that's much more than just charging interest on a loan, although interest isn't, of course, it is usury. But when you then look, you can hear already I'm equating usury and riba, using them in the same sense. When you look into the history of usury in Europe, then you find it also is much more than just interest on the loan. And a friend and colleague from Mecca, Ammar Firdaus, wrote a PhD on this, and it was provocatively titled "A Convergence of Civilizations: the rise, the ascendancy of usury over Jewish, Christian, and Muslim commerce," or I think the rise to ascendancy. It's not as yet published, but it's in the process of being published. And his research into the history of usury among the Jews, and then the Christians, and now today the Muslims, showed 2 things. One was that we all basically had almost identical sharia governing these matters. And the second thing was that when anybody tried to circumvent the prohibitions of usury, they used very similar means in all 3 cases. So it's a very useful kind of historical work going through the history way back, in fact, because in Sumeria and Babylon, they were cultures based on usury. They were based on usury in grains, and they periodically saw that this led to destitution and then enslavement, because in the ancient world, which was someone who got into unpayable debt became the slave of the creditor until he had worked off the debt.
Yeah, there's a book called The Price of Time, recent one, and it goes to the history of interest, and he talks about in the Babylonian period, there was usually in livestock, so people would say, I'm going to lend you a goat or 2 goats. In a few years' time, I want 3 goats back.
Yes.
And these kinds of things happening. Yeah.
Yes. So it's very ancient, and all civilizations have sort of wrestled with it. There's a term we have, which is the Jubilee, which comes to us through the Israelites, but in fact goes back to these ancient cities, and that was when the debts became so overwhelming for so many people, then they were forgiven. The debts were forgiven, and people who'd been enslaved because of their debts were set free. There's a periodic reset of the whole society. So people saw, they've all cultures throughout time, they've wrestled with this issue of usury and then the problems that it brings about. And
usually it's one of those things which, like, not just the religious Abrahamic tradition where in Exodus God condemns usury. He says, "Do not take interest."
Yes.
The Christians, the Jews, even in the Muslims, interest is a great sin. Even Aristotle and Plato, they talk about usury, and Aristotle said it's like birthing money from money, and he condemns it.
Yes. Yes.
But there's an ancient wisdom that usually avoid it. It's sinful. It leads to chaos and destruction.
Yes.
And you get it up until like 12th, 3rd century in the UK. In England, it was conventional for people to look down on moneylenders. But that started to change at some point. How did usually become a cornerstone of the financial system? How did it become accepted in society?
Well, you find I don't know very much about the Jewish banking in Italy. There was somewhere around about the 13th and those century, there were Jewish money lenders in Italy. But when you come into the time just before the Renaissance, then you find Italian bankers. You find the Medici, where, for example, they're a very emblematic story. And there's a very good documentary and based on a book with the same name, which is that the Medici, godfathers of the Renaissance. And they're a very interesting story. But the point was that they were Christians. Their great aspiration was to become bankers for the Pope. And in fact, two later Medicis became themselves popes. But they lived within the understanding that it was a sin, that it wasn't just a sin, it was a mortal sin. A usurer could be denied the last rites. In other words, he could be denied the presence of a priest at his bedside when he was dying, and prayers said for him, and he could be denied a Christian burial in a Christian graveyard. That was how serious it was regarded. And the Medici were in fact Christians, and they did believe it. They believed in God, and they believed in the peril that they put their souls in. And one of them, I always think it was Cosimo, but I might have got it mixed up. But one of them talked to a cardinal, and the cardinal confirmed that this was a mortal sin. And he said, well, what can I do? And he said, what we would say is that you have to restore everything you've gained by it to the people. You have to restore this and stop doing it. And so he couldn't do that. He couldn't walk away from it. And so he invented something that is very significant right up until today, and that is philanthropy. He rather than restoring what he'd taken unjustly, he started to give it away. But he became, the source of much of the Renaissance, because he financed Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Later, Medici financed Galileo. He was the patron of Galileo. And so by this philanthropy, they tried to ease their guilty consciences as believing Christians. And they then did this thing. They brought about this huge transformation. I'm not describing this only to the Medici or only to this cause, but this is a very significant part of what happened in the Renaissance. And it led to the Reformation, because it was a Medici Pope who transformed what was called the sale of indulgences, because people would give some money to the church for charitable purposes to lessen their sins, and in the Catholic thinking, to get them through purgatory, the punishment of purgatory. And this Medici Pope basically turned this into an industrial operation. He had the friars and traveling across Europe, selling this stuff. They were printing it, because the printing press was just invented, and they were printing these indulgences, and they were raking in a huge fortune. And this is one of the things that incensed Martin Luther. Martin Luther found this quite correctly. He found it abhorrent, along with many other things. And so it contributed to the Reformation. And because of the widespread corruption in Catholicism, the Catholic Church, then the reformists, the Protestants, the protesters, quite sympathetically, they tried to reform Christianity and go back to the beginning. And Calvin was asked as a lawyer to make a constitution for the city of Geneva, and he wanted to prohibit usury totally. Yeah, you have to understand that in Catholic times, while it was a sin, they could be charging as much as 250% on a loan. And so Calvin, people said to him, everybody ignores, and they will continue, the businessmen will continue to ignore the prohibitions of usury. So it's totally pointless to make it completely illegal. And so he was persuaded to permit something like 4%. And he hedged it around with qualifications, as long as the recipient wasn't put into great hardship and all things like that. But then what he had done, well-meaningly, was then to open the door for Christian banking. In other words, it wouldn't be a sin any longer. It could even be a virtue. And so Protestantism brought about a kind of banker who felt himself to be a virtuous person, a good citizen. And this led to the famous Protestant banks like Lloyd's and Barclays, etc., and led to the modern world. Really leads to the modern world.
Oh, right. So
But,
it has its origins in,
sorry?
so it has its origins in Italy.
Yes, that type of banking begins to come around in Italy. They have what's called they talk about what are called the long centuries, and there's a long century of banking in Italy. There's a long century of banking in Amsterdam, and then the long century in London, and then the center of banking moved to New York. But you asked also about the philosophers, and one of the things that happened around the same time is that the philosopher, because there was a tradition, you have the Middle Ages, and you have the conflict with Galileo was very much to do with the fact that Aristotle was married to the church. They had taken him over. It wasn't that he wasn't contravening church doctrine; he was contravening Aristotle. And what happened after that was that, for example, Descartes, then they severed the link with their tradition, and they began to think from first principles, what they thought were first principles. And this also led philosophers eventually to, there's a man called Bentham, then he writes a book called In Defense of Usury. So they regarded it no longer as a moral or a philosophical crime, but as a thing that you could approach rationally and make up your own mind about.
That's quite fascinating. I know there was a debate which happened in the UK. I think there's a bishop and another guy who wrote, Thomas Dowden, I think, in 1572. Has a book, and he has a famous quote in it where he calls Usury the devourer of nations, and he says it's on the same line as adultery and murder, and anyone who does usury should be just killed.
Yes,
punishment.
Yes.
So that's how seriously they treated it back in the day.
They did indeed, and it was a very widespread conversation. It caused, everybody was involved. One of the things that it's very important for us to understand as well, that the Reformation was an appalling period of history of actual, physical violence and civil war, really, a European civil war. The 30 Years' War was one of the worst episodes in European history, and all of these things were in it. The controversy over sovereignty and the nature of political authority, and then also theological matters and this issue of usury. They were all in the controversy of the Reformation. It was a very bitter period, and they say that as much as a third of the population of Europe died in the strife of that time.
Wow. So why is usury such a bad thing? Because it seems like they're trying to get away from the past where it's forbidden, and they want to embrace usury. But why is God so strong, and why is he strong in his condemnation of usury?
Well, it's interesting to look at the riba, the word there, because it's to do with, the root is to do with growth and increase, and all the transactions are what's important in a transaction is there's a sort of an equitable transaction. The image of it, of course, are the scales, when the scales balance. But there are exceptions to it. For example, when you go into our sources, you will find that the famous thing that gold must be exchanged for gold, hand to hand, like for like. In other words, the same weight. When you come to something like a splendid horse, you don't have to exchange one horse for another horse, because they have one horse has got superb qualities and the other is a slow and difficult creature. So then you can, in those cases, then there's they don't have to be like for like, but the image of justice in the end is this image of the scales that where when they balance, then the transaction is a just one. And so a part of it is that we have to think holistically of the society, so that people think, oh, this is just my private transaction. If I choose if I choose to pay the interest, it's just my circumstance, and it's a private matter. But the nature of currency and wealth is that currency is a social thing. It's something, all it has to do, in fact, in a society is to circulate. That it has to go around. And if you interrupt this circulation by someone charging, not exchanging in an equitable fashion, then it affects the whole. It's by its nature. So we very much misunderstand currency. All it has to do is go around. It has to go around. And Fitra people understand it, which is why they often spend and give away generously, because in a natural condition, you know that what you give away comes back. It goes around and comes back. So this is the nature of money. But this wanting to take something out of it, take something extra out of it, it has a societal impact. And then, yes.
And how does usury take out from the circulation of money?
It's in many, many different ways. And many of the forms, so we're not talking about necessarily just interest. For example, a futures market is a classical usurious institution. And some years ago, I caught a documentary on the cocoa markets of West Africa. And what happened there was that the big chocolate companies had, well, the cocoa producers used to have, they were connected together almost like guilds. Possibly the governments were involved, so they didn't consider themselves to be individuals. They consider themselves as a body, and they were persuaded that if they broke that, each of them could negotiate better deals for themselves, and so they broke that. They lost that collective attitude towards it. But then they were basically, actually, it worked against them, and so they find themselves bidding against each other, and the prices of the cocoa went down. But at the same time, the prices of chocolate in all over the world were going up. Cocoa prices were going down and chocolate was going up. And then you find out that there was these futures markets where they were selling the cocoa years before it was planted. It was bought and sold years before it was planted. And the wealth was actually going into into these futures traders. It was going to them. It wasn't. So the people who made the documentary said, whatever you do, don't stop eating chocolate. That's not the right response to this. You have to look at something like this, these futures traders. So now we've broached this idea that it's much, much wider than just the simple charging of interest and debt.
Yeah, and I think in Islamic finance, there's a rule where if there's a transaction going on, you can either defer delivery or you can defer payment, but you can't defer both.
Yes.
And futures market, both are deferred. Payment is deferred. You have the expiry date, and then delivery is deferred as well at the expiry date. So you can just speculate and shuffle the contracts in between a handful of traders, generate lots of profits, and then the farmers don't see the end of that. Yeah.
But also our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited the sale of food before taking delivery of it. It's a specific thing. You may not sell food if you haven't got it in your possession, and you don't have ownership of it. You have to have taken possession of it. And one of the things that happened in Medina was that they used to issue chits, which were called sukuk, to I think it was to the fighting men, and they could go to the market, souk al-jar it was called, and they could collect foodstuffs there. So the chits were for food. They were for food. And then some people were selling the chits for money because they needed the funds. They thought, I need the funds more than I need the food. And two of the companions went to the governor of Medina and said, so you've declared usury halal. And he said, what are you talking about? And they said, these chits that people are selling in the souk al-jar. And so he sent his officers to the market, and they took the chits off the people who bought them and returned them. They undid all these transactions. So there's a very fundamental breaking of the sharia there. And one of the things the ulama say is that riba has got a general sense, which is basically any infringement of the sharia of trade. And then this is the specific sense of this idea of growth, of illegal extra in a transaction.
Yeah. And with usury, do you also have this issue where effectively what's happening is wealth is being transferred from the poor to the rich because the rich can afford to lend, and then they charge interest, and the poor are paying the interest to the rich, and also there's the idea of risk. So the lender assumes no risk on the loan. So and therefore, if the poor person cannot pay the loan, they take the collateral, and the poor person is left with nothing, and then the rich person is even richer.
Yes.
And this is what God
Absolutely.
is trying to prevent from happening.
No, this is where we are all over the world with, we've seen this extraordinary thing. For example, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, people who had no background at all in wealth and standing in the society were suddenly billionaires. And this is happening in many, many countries at this moment. Suddenly a new clique of people have emerged. And at the same time, huge swathes of the population are reduced to poverty or bare survival. And we're not like the socialists. We don't blame the wealthy and we don't despise wealth as such, but the Sharia, and here an important term to introduce into our vocabulary is mu'amalat. Yeah, because the mu'amalat are the rulings of the Sharia that cover ordinary transactions, and a subsection are then the mu'amalat of tijara, of buying and selling, etc. Mm-hmm. So that it's perfectly acceptable, and some of the companions were very wealthy. They were very wealthy, but they were not oligarchs, and the actual character of a Muslim society is very much more horizontal in a sense that wealth is distributed much more throughout the society. But nevertheless, you can have very poor people, and many famous Muslims chose lives of poverty. They chose it. They preferred it. That's also acceptable. But there are many things that come into it. One of the things that comes into it are also the laws of inheritance, because in Europe you had what was called primogeniture, which was the firstborn male got the lot. He got everything. Yeah, which understandably made the second-born male and the third-born male and daughters resentful, because they were put in an invidious position. But the Sharia says, if you make a will, you can give a third as you like. You can give it to people who wouldn't inherit from you. You can give it to Muslims. You can give it to non-Muslims. You can invest in al-Qaf, which is an investment for the akhirah, for the next life. But the rest of your wealth is none of your business. It goes algebraically to, husband, wife, sons, daughters, father, mother, grandparents, etc. It's a wonderful science, but it means that you won't get oligarchic fortunes building up.
Mhm.
You get wealthy individuals, but then naturally it will begin to spread out again into the society.
Yeah, in a few generations, Islamically, like everyone has very little of that remaining wealth because
Yeah.
of the division and even in Europe, you had bastard children who they could not inherit. But there's no such thing in Islam. There's no child is illegitimate.
Yes. So absolutely, and you can't have this silly thing where you get fights in the family and someone disinherits a daughter or a son and says you're not getting a thing just because there's been a quarrel. You can't do that. It's just not legitimate. And if you like detective stories, how many of them are based around, particularly in the Agatha Christie and that era, they're based around an inheritance and the ill will that was caused by it. A lot of Europe suffered from a thing called the second son problem, and that arguably was one of the contributed to the Crusades, because the Europeans, as I said, the first son inherited title and estate, everything, and the second sons were said, go off to Palestine and win yourself a fortune. So all it's a catastrophe.
Yeah. About interest. So you've also talked about money and the nature of paper money. How are these things interlinked, and what are the consequences of paper money?
Yes. Well, it's a really important theme for us because you when you see this, then even interest pales into insignificance. If you, once the nice illustration is the famous story about the goldsmith, and this is he's held to be one of the origins of paper money, and that is where the goldsmith is the man in the town who has a safe. He keeps his precious his jewels and things in a safe, and for example, in our society, in the Muslim society, there were trustworthy people, and people would bring their belongings to the trustworthy person and say, "Would you look after them for me?" Our Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Amin. And this was a part of it. He left Ali radiallahu anhu behind on the Hijrah to restore all the things that people had left with him on trust. And there's a very amazing story about Az-Zubair radiallahu anhu, who was in the same position. People had left a fortune with him because they trusted him. Now, coming back to Europe, then the goldsmith, people went to him and they said, "Would you look after my gold and my silver?" And he said, "Fine." And he wrote a receipt to them. And all well and good. And even probably it's legitimate to charge a little bit in order to look after the wealth. But the goldsmith found something, which was that people began to use these pieces of paper rather than going and collecting their gold and then paying off somebody with the gold. They said to them, "Look, I have this receipt for my gold that's with Mr. Goldsmith, and if I give it to you, he will honor it and give you the gold." And so the goldsmith saw that these pieces of paper were becoming money. They were becoming money. And of course, all he had to do was write on a piece of paper. That was all he had to do, was write on a piece of paper. So this is the beginning of this idea of paper money. Yeah, and you know, there are famous figures mentioned as to how much you can write before it endangers the whole thing. But even if you stay within the limits, people mention, you know, you can write 12 times as much as you hold on deposit, stuff like that. And it leads to some of the modern banking laws. But nevertheless, at some point, people are uneasy and they want their money. They feel insecure and they go to get their money, and that always brings a bank crash. Throughout the history of banking, there are these crashes because people felt insecure because everybody knew, in fact, there was more paper than there was gold. And that, you know, led to various bank crashes. Then they invented central banks, theoretically anyway, as a safeguard. So then to be a bank, you had to then lodge something with the central bank, and in crises like this, then the central bank would draw on all the banks in order to save a bank where there was a run on the bank. But nevertheless, banks continued to go down, and we come then to the era of, you know, because of the Second World War. Part of the Second World War is that Europeans basically moved all their gold to America, and the British were paying for arms from buying arms from the Americans. So all of the gold ended up in America. And so after the war, they had this famous Bretton Woods conference, and they made this agreement that you couldn't go to the bank and get your gold back. That was over, except for the dollar. And then this gave the dollar, you know, I always remember in my youth traveling in the Muslim world, you know, everybody said, you know, before you travel, take dollars because everybody wants the dollar. And the Americans promised not to exploit this, but they did exploit it. They invented dollars. They spent dollars like crazy. And this then led to the next stage, which was at the time of de Gaulle. De Gaulle said, I don't want any more of your dollars. Just, you owe me money, pay me gold. Yes? And de Gaulle was then removed by a very strange means. He was removed from office. But Nixon took notice of all of this, and he cut the link with gold so that the dollar itself could not be converted to gold. And then you have basically the petrodollar. That was when it was equated to petroleum, basically. But now we've ended up where we are, which is quantitative easing and total fiat money. And fiat is Latin, yes, and it's in the Bible, in the Latin version of the Bible, where it's said in Genesis, where, you know, at the beginning God said, "Let there be light. Let there be light," which is fiat lux. Fiat lux. Well, fiat is a command. Let there be. Let there be. And this is something like the divine command in the Quran, kun fayakun. But this only belongs to the divinity. It's not. It's not a power that belongs to the human being to bring something into existence by a command. That's not it. So this is it's already theologically dangerous, but that there's not a backing there for it is everybody in the world. It's one of the important themes in the world today. The so-called BRICS countries, etc., are trying to go back to backing a currency with gold. To which I'd only say that backing is the problem. If a currency is a paper and it's backed by gold, somebody's always going to write more bits of paper than there is gold to back it. Always will happen.
Yeah, we've got a situation where globally, I think almost every country in the world now has so much national debt that you're kind of forced to have economic growth, because to service the debt, you need to grow the economy. Right?
Exactly. exactly.
And because of usually we have this kind of system now where we have infinite economic growth, and this puts incredible strain on the environment.
Yes.
Because we have to keep on extracting more and more and more and more. Is there a way out of this?
We have to say the deen is the way out of it, as you know, and a non-usurious life, and a part of that then is to there's a thing that has to be healed in the deen, which is this idea that the ibadat, the acts of worship, are different from the mu'amalat. Yes, mu'amalat, because what was done among the ulama was that they put the idea forward that somehow everyday transactions were in a different zone. They're not, you know, you have to really look after your wudu and your prayer and all of these things and get that all right. So something went out of balance because people began to take these things much more seriously. For you know, I won't mention the groups, but you know, we've seen it in our lives that the attention to outward forms of piety become really important. And on the other hand, the people said, well, the mu'amalat don't matter. I mean, they're very serious people saying it's not actually part of the revelation. It's to do with public benefit. You can make it up and you can do it as you like. There's a theme, if you don't mind a little bit of fiqh, but there's what's called the usul al-fiqh, which is a science that all the people of knowledge use. And then there's an important one, which is called al-maqasid. Maqasid is a science that delineates the purposes of the sharia. And this is something, it's not a source of ruling, but it helps particularly a mufti to reach a judgment saying, well, what is going on here? Let's not just apply the rule, but what is the point of it? And the sources, the maqasid, are that in other words, the sharia is not arbitrary. It's not an arbitrary religious law. It's for our benefit. Allah revealed the sharia for the benefit of human beings, and therefore they delineated these maqasid as for the preservation of a deen, to preserve the deen, to preserve life, human life, to preserve intellect. So in other words, intoxicants are prohibited, not because they're fun, but because you lose intellect, and when you lose intellect, you're in trouble. You get into trouble. To preserve lineage, so adultery is prohibited because it will confuse lineage, and many things are tied up with that, and it's a catastrophe if you examine it. And there's a fifth, and I've forgotten.
I think it's property rights.
Hmm?
I think it's property rights.
Property, yes, wealth. So this was the one that is important here. Some people add a sixth, which is honor, which, but people agree on these five. So property is so what people say. For example, you get to the modern age, and people say, well, you have to safeguard the wealth of the Muslims. So I'm confronted with the problem of renting a house or buying a house. Yes, and the mortgage, we all think that this transaction is not a healthy one. And on the other hand, renting means that I rent a house for decades.
You pay someone else's mortgage.
Yeah, well, that's also the case, yes. But say that's not the case, but just that I have rented a house for 2 decades, and then I'm given notice to leave, then I've gained nothing at all. So people gave fatwas saying then the maqasid say that you have to safeguard the wealth of the Muslims. Therefore, even though the mortgage is a haram, usurious contract, it safeguards your wealth, and you can own a house. So it became a kind of, it contributed to this, first of all, this idea that that it comes from this idea that the mu'amalat, the ordinary transactions, are somehow different from the acts of ibadah, and that you can, to some extent, you can make it up. You can, there are very, very extreme interpretations that are adopted by people, Muslim people, of what's legitimate in mu'amalat.
One scholar said to me, "There's no such thing as living a religious life. There's just obeying God's, like living God's law, living life and being godly about it. So obeying the law, which is the sharia. Everything is first in it."
Yes, absolutely. And mu'amalat is the plural of mu'amala, which is behavior. It's behavior, and it's a saying of the ulama, but that encapsulates a lot. And they say ad-din al-mu'amala. Deen is behavior. It is behavior. So how you transact and all of these things, it is part of your deen. It's not a separate thing. I was always very struck when I found out that the first ayats revealed in Medina on the Hijrah, almost before the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had arrived in Medina, were the ayats of Surat al-Mutaffifin. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wailul lil mutaffifin alladhina idha talu ala nasi yastawfun wa idha kaluhum aw wazanuhum yukhsirun. So the point about the ayat, I'll leave it because I don't have the translation in front of me. I'm not too keen to translate it on the wing. But the point about the ayat was that the people of Medina had thought that the market is different from the mosque. That you go to the mosque and you pray and you're pious. You go into the market, and that's just the nature of the market. Is you do what you can defraud and do all of these types of things. And they realized that you have to behave in the market in the same way that you behave in the mosque, with no less piety. And it was a very crucial moment. And this was the first moment of the Hijrah, after the Hijrah, as the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam arrived in Medina.
I see. And bringing it back to usury, when you say, like, let's think about the mortgages question, right?
Yes.
Could it not be argued that in order for Muslims to do well in life, to prosper, we need security, and therefore, if there is no other way of obtaining security, which is like owning a home, because you can't do much if you don't own your house, you live in financial insecurity, that it becomes necessary to allow for such things like mortgages, or at least for the first house.
Well, you see, you've put that's quite an equation. Do you understand? There's quite a set of steps that you've put there. And all my life I rented a house. I've rented a house all my life, and I find myself at this age where I own a house, and it's not. I won't go into how that happened, but I and most of my close friends, we rented. There's an assumption that you need to own a house. Imam Malik didn't own a house. Yes, he didn't own a house. The Harun al-Rashid when he found that out, he sent him a pile of gold saying, "Buy a house," and it sat untouched. He didn't touch it, and people say he was renting the house that had been the house of Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anhu, and that was precious to him. So it's not the case. If you talk about secure, a part of that is the meaning of Iman. Iman has, Islam has got the sense of making safe. Iman has got the sense of being secure. It's being secure is a quality of the heart, but we're not secure with things. That's not our deen to be secure with deens. My Sheikh's first sheikh, his teacher, who was a Moroccan scholar and alim, a third of his teaching was to show how shirk Not all the Muslims are free from outward shirk. It's not, we're not like these people who accuse Muslims of shirk. That's not the case. But none of us are safe from hidden shirk. That's something that all the people of Islam have been very alert to, and a part of hidden shirk is simple things like thinking that the remedy made you well. Yes. Mm-hmm. And it's not saying that you give up the remedy, but you when you take the remedy, you know that you're transacting with Allah before the doctor. Yes. So it's something for us to recover, really, is this relationship to it's how you relate with things in the world, which we have to do. We have to relate with the things, but without attributing effective power to the things. Mm-hmm. You don't get your security from a house. That's not where you get your security from. And I'm not arguing against what you said in that sense, but to assume that there is security in owning a house is not the case. People have, one of the things that was shocking for us now, have we time? I don't want to go too far. Yeah. But one of in the Margaret Thatcher, what she did was that she came upon an era where you had what was called a building society. Yes. And the building societies were underneath the Friendly Societies Act. And thus they had no shareholders. So if you were a member of a building society, you were a shareholder. Even then, you could, with a loan from a building society, you could still end up paying 3 times the value of the house if you had a 25-year mortgage. So but she changed it, and she allowed the banks to go into the housing market, and she allowed the building societies to go into the banking market and allowing shareholders into it. So the enriching oligarchs again, and changing the whole nature of British housing. As you've got what's called the property ladder, and you've got people taking second and third mortgages, and the whole idea of getting a house to live in is not, people are looking on them as properties, as it's part of the economy in a way that was never done before. So so going back again to the building societies, because they were built on a basis of using paper money, and they were part of this wider economy, even though they didn't have shareholders. Nevertheless, somebody could take a 25-year mortgage, and after 20 years, they might fall ill and not be able to make the payments, and find that they had only been paying the interest. They deferred the payment of the capital until the end of the process. So people had paid well over the value of the house, several times the value of the house, and still didn't own anything. Don't hold me to the numbers and the years and all of that, but the first part of the repayments went towards repaying the interest on the loan. So there was no security in them at all. It was a mistake to think of that as you owning a house. You owned a debt. It's called a mortgage, Mort is death, engage is a pledge. A mortgage was a death pledge. It is a death pledge.
Wonderful. Just quickly, to end now. What are some things we can do to try and steer the economy away from usury? I mean, I understand we're never going to, and anytime soon, it's not going to overnight, usury is going to be emitted, but what can we do to try and steer it towards a more godly direction?
Well, first, we have to, Islam is a knowledge based deen, and one of the falsities is to think that knowledge is the preserve of ulama. And being the ulama are an important group of people, yes, but it means people of knowledge. But every Muslim man and woman is obliged to find the knowledge of that they need. When the first knowledge is you have to know you have to know Allah and His messengers, and have a proper articulated understanding of what you need to know. And if you then say the Shahada and become a Muslim, then at the time of dhuhr, you have to know how to do the prayer. And when the month of Ramadan comes, you need, before Ramadan begins, you have to know what's involved. And when you step into the market, you have to know what's halal and what's haram in the marketplace. So, and it's really not good enough to depend on fatwas from ulama. Where they come in are the bits where problematic cases, and you think, oh, I'm not quite sure here. So there at that point you need a fatwa. But it really, each Muslim man and woman needs to know what is halal and what's haram when they go into the world. So that's the first thing, is a restoration of that, not passing it over to a priestly class, because there is no church in Islam, there is no priesthood in Islam. It's not our deen. So you by wrong adab, we turn ulama into priests, and that's a huge mistake. But obviously, I'm not going to learn every single thing for every occurrence that I ever come against. And at some point, I'm going to ask somebody who knows more than I do and get their advice. So it's a fundamental thing that we need to recover. And really, an encouragingly large number of Muslims are now really learning their deen. It's very encouraging, particularly in the West. But there's new generations now who are, they're not becoming professional scholars of the deen, but they've made it their business to know their deen, to learn Arabic as best they can, sharia, the aqidah, and all of these things. And this is a very hopeful sign. And this has to also extend to the marketplace. We have to bring into our consciousness that this is just as important, because every single one of us, in one way or another, goes into the market. We go into the market. And then there is retrieval of a full picture of the muamalat, and we intrinsically think we're talking about the contracts and the transactions, but we've talked about paper money, so we have to somehow get back physical money, gold and silver, and a third one, which is flus. And the flus was small change. It was little copper coins, and we need to have markets. We need to have markets where the rules of the market are the same as the rules of the mosque, that you can't reserve a place and you can't charge for its use. So there's a whole outline of things that we need to bring back, and we have to think for the deen rather than just for our own survival. Of course we have our own needs and things like that, but we have to begin thinking for the deen in its entirety. I don't know if that's just a beginning, but there is a picture of what a Muslim economy, what a Muslim society, a non-usurious economy and society look like. And it will, once we restore that consciousness, then we will all, nobody has all the answers. No one person's got all the answers, but if we bring our own hearts and our intellects to this issue, it will be solved.
I think that's a good note to end on. Yeah, to keep learning about the deen and apply it in all realms of life, not just the ibadat, the muamalat as well. All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Abdassamad, for coming on. It's been wonderful. I've learned a lot. I'm sure any listeners will learn a lot as well.
Inshallah, I hope so. Thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm just trying to stop the recording 1 second.